So when I teach cognitive psychology, one of the topics that's always difficult to talk about is decision making, because decision making is such a well-researched topic in cognitive psychology. We have decades of research exploring how people make decisions. Do our minds work rationally? Do they work emotionally? What information do we take in before we decide what is best for us? Now we go over to social psychology and things get even more complicated because our decisions are based on not only our own personal experience, but the experience of others around us. So there's that social component. Working with other people, is it good or bad? Does it help you make better decisions? As we're going to discuss, some cases, yes, in other cases, no. So let's get into the social psychology of how being part of a group can improve your performance or, in other cases, can lead to worse performance. We need to establish some basics first. So when I'm talking about groups in this presentation, what do I mean as a psychologist by a group? What defines a group? So we'll talk about defining a group and social identity. We'll also go over just the basics of how a group tends to form and stick around. The definition of a group is actually what a philosopher might refer to as a fuzzy concept. The definition of a social group is hard to pin down because it's so tied up in context. Um, Entitativity refers to something like groupiness. It is the perception by members of a group or by others that people make up a group. So one way to define a group is if people feel like they're part of a group, that's a group. Obviously, that's not a very scientific definition, but when we look at groups as they are defined in society, it is very hard to pin down whether there's not a line that demarcates a social group from not a social group. The borders of that concept are very fuzzy. So when we talk about groups in this presentation, I'm going to often use the broadest definition possible, which is that if people feel like they're part of a group, they are a group. Now, we can experimentally push people to be more or less likely to identify as a group, but even that comes with some problems. There was this problem that early psychologists discovered. Well, I call it a problem, but maybe they wouldn't consider it, where it's actually very difficult for humans not to be part of a group. There's this experimental manipulation we use that is nowadays called a minimal group paradigm, which is where you bring people into a study and have them develop a group identity. It's difficult for humans not to develop a group identity. A minimal group paradigm, nowadays, there are plenty of examples of this, is just you bring people into your study and have them interact with each other for a little bit, and suddenly they develop a group identity. Humans are so quick to develop bonds with other people that we do it so automatically based on really arbitrary things. So humans form groups extremely quickly. Why does it happen so quickly? We've explored this. One is that we tend to just have feelings of loyalty based on similarity that develop really quickly. So as soon as you meet with another person, you try to look for similarities. And if we're all part of a psychology study and we're all assigned to one group, that kind of become that is silly how little information you have about somebody else can become the basis for connection with that person. We also, there's this feedback effect where we view other people who have the same social norms as us to be part of our group. And so you can start from, if I identify you follow the same social norms as I do, I feel like we might be part of the same group. But if we're working together, we may develop social norms, and that will make us feel like we're part of the same group. So it's this chicken and egg that both feed each other. Humans notoriously all the time signal what social norms we use with each other. If I walk up to someone and I shake somebody's hand, I've immediately established if we both shake hands, we have this shared set of behaviors. If two people walk up to each other and they both automatically bow to each other in recognition, that establishes we follow the same rules when greeting somebody else. That can, bring people in, make them feel like they're part of something bigger. One example of a study that used this minimal intergroup paradigm that I'm mentioning, Hertel and Kerr in 2001, they were specifically trying to figure out why that the minimal intergroup paradigm makes people get into groups so quickly. They manipulated people's feelings of loyalty or equality by priming, which is a cognitive effect where they reminded people of those concepts that get them to be thinking about those things, and found that both of those effects, when they were primed, led to increased in-group favoritism and in-group identification compared to a control group. So what they're investigating are what are the reasons people form groups so fast, and they believe that if you have people thinking about loyalty to group members, that might be one of the keys. So as I mentioned, why do we form groups with others? One explanation is similarity. So we try to find similarities with other people. You can also push people to find more similarities with each other. When people feel more similar, they get into more of a group mindset. We do this very easily. It can happen like as a result of the mere exposure effect. I think we've talked about that before. The mere exposure phenomenon is this finding that just being around other people, just seeing someone else frequently, makes you feel more positively towards them. So even if you're not interacting very much with someone else, if you just encounter someone else frequently, you might start feeling like they're part of my group. Like I mentioned, the development of group norms is also important to establishing that you're part of a group with someone else. This also helps you develop part of your social identity. Remember that social identity refers to the part of your self-concept that you feel like a part of your identity is being a part of social groups. So once you start feeling like your identity is tied up with your relationships with other people, you're starting to feel like you're part of a group. Part of my identity is tied up in the university that I work for. Part of my identity is tied up in groups that I'm a part of. So whether I want to or not, my brain is pushing me toward identifying with those groups because it's part of my identity. Different psychologists have kind of different perspectives on how groups form. A very simple model is that when a group starts to form at the group level, not at the individual level, first you just have to see relationships developing among a group of people. There's got to be some kind of conflict that unites this group together. Then they start to develop social norms, they start to develop behaviors. Finally, the group disbands. So let's focus in for now on that storming and conflict part. Because part of the reason that groups form is they all need to address a common problem. Here, I'm a member of the university community. We, as a community, need to conduct the business of the university. There wouldn't be a reason for all these people to be together if it wasn't for that shared goal. So you need some kind of shared goal, shared enemy, and you also need to agree with other group members on what the priorities of a group are going to be. And that may cause conflict. That may cause disagreement among individuals. When you're first forming a group with other people, is conflict, is disagreeing with each other, arguing with each other, debating with each other a good thing? Research indicates that the answer is somewhat yes. Conflict early on in a group's formation is good when it's in moderation. If you have no conflict at all, you don't have an enemy, you don't have any disagreements, then the group is boring. People get bored, they don't feel like they need to be a part of the group. But too much conflict, if the problems are too large, it can lead to a group disbanding. So some conflict is good, too much conflict can lead to a group not existing. Let's move now into the core of today's presentation, which is how people work together and the effects that having other people around, the effect that has on your performance. So we're going to talk, for example, about one of the earliest social psychology studies performed on social facilitation. Social facilitation and social inhibition are different ways that your behavior can change when you know there's other people around. Next, we'll talk about when groups work together and they produce more than they would individually or less. Why would one happen instead of the other? We'll talk about different tasks that might be better for groups or better to work on as an individual. And finally, we'll talk about some problems and maybe how to avoid those problems when you're working in a group, such as groupthink. All right, before we talk about groups again, let's take a detour for a second and just kind of ask the question of when other people are around, how does that change our behavior? This is one of the earliest questions and really is the heart of the field of social psychology, is how our behavior changes when other people are around. Well, one of the earliest formal studies in this was Triplett's work on social facilitation. So he asked the question, there's these people that were racing bicycles, and people might notice that they race better when they have a crowd watching them. So why don't we scientifically test this? Why don't we use a stopwatch and look at people's times racing with and without people witnessing them? And we find this effect, which we've called social facilitation, which is that when you are in a social setting, your behavior is facilitated. People rode their bikes competitively faster if they had people watching them. So social facilitation is when your behavior improves when other people are observing you. Now, he didn't find it in that original study, but I'm going to introduce the idea of social inhibition, which could also occur. That's when your behavior gets worse when other people are observing. So now we have an idea that your behavior can change when other people are observing it. When do you tend to get better and when do you tend to get worse when other people are watching you while you're doing something? We know in some circumstances you do get better and others you get worse. Psychologists have tried to investigate several different moderators. One is task difficulty. So the thinking here is that maybe why you get better or worse when you're under social pressure is that maybe if the task is very difficult, that is different than if the task is very easy. So what do we actually find? Generally, on more simple tasks, we get better when we're under observation, but on more complex tasks, our performance gets worse with observation. So maybe that's it. Simple things, when other people are watching, we feel the pressure, we maybe get better. Maybe this is because automatic processes are handled differently by your brain. So nowadays, if somebody's watching me tie my shoe, for an example, that is an extremely simple process for me. I do that automatically. If somebody's watching me tie my shoe, my behavior doesn't change very much. But what about me when I was 4 years old and I was learning to tie my shoe? I could do it when I was on my own, but if my parents were watching me and waiting for me to tie my shoe, suddenly I fell apart. I just couldn't do it. It took me twice as long to do it. Why is this? Well, maybe the social pressure, if the behavior is complex and not automatic yet, the social pressure causes me to put a lot of resources into trying to engage in that behavior so much that I get nervous, I get distracted, and I do worse. This actually leads to a second perspective on this issue, which is that it's not exactly about whether the task is easy or difficult. It's about our dominant response. Zion is a good example of an early social psychologist who was influential in a lot of the stuff in our textbook, proposed that it's not exactly easy versus difficult. It's that when you're being observed, whatever the dominant response is for that situation, that will get stronger, right? The dominant response. So whatever the dominant response is, that will be easier for you to do when you're under observation. The dominant response being whatever your default response is, your default behavior in a situation. So riding a bike, that is very automatic. That is not a cognitively complex process. You're already on a bike. Pedaling the bike is the dominant response in that situation. So you get better when other people are observing you because you're just doing more of what your behavior is anyway. Now, the next question is, how do we know if working as a group is better than individuals just working by themselves? So, very simple concept, little tiny bit of math, and that is the concept of process gains or losses by working in a group rather than as individuals. Imagine with this simple example that Al is making 10 cogs per day at the factory. Bo is making 7 cogs per day at the factory. So when they're working by themselves, very simple math, they're making 17 cogs per day. But let's say they get assigned to a team where they're working together and they're making 20 cogs per day. The difference between 17 and 20 would be a process gain. That means that a group working together is doing better than individuals working separate. A process loss would be if the group effort added together is lower than the group members added up separately. So a very simple concept, but unfortunately, it's often a lot harder to measure that when the group effort is not about making, numbers of units of something. It's much harder to measure this, but we have some ways, and most of the research I'm going to be talking about for a while is not about how to measure this, but is actually about what we know about how to get our process gains to be higher and how to avoid process losses. We know that in a lot of cases, working together as a group produces less work overall than people coming together individually. So what exactly is the advantage of being in a group? One of the easiest things we've discovered is that when a task needs to be completed that requires different specializations, it's better to work with a group and to divide people's responsibilities up by specializations. Let's say that you are working individually and there's 10 steps to complete a process. You're really great at steps 3 and 4. You're not good at the rest. Wouldn't it be better to combine your skills with somebody that's great at steps 5 and 6 so that you take care of 3 and 4, they take care of 5 and 6, and you work on the rest together? So there's some interesting research about different tasks that the individual performance is a better predictor versus your group contribution is a better predictor at success. Basketball, for example, is an example that's been studied where people's individual contributions aren't the best predictor of their group success. So your individual performance as a basketball player contributes to your success, but there's some kind of group coordination that goes above and beyond that. This is actually in contrast to studies have found that baseball teams, the best predictor of a baseball team's success is looking at the individual skills that makes up all the players. There's less of a contribution, not none, but less of a contribution of working well as a group. Now, psychologists work at dividing a problem up into its parts, and that's what we're going to do here by thinking about different types of task goals and when group labor is better or when individuals labor for some of these different situations. First is whether the task that the group is working on is divisible or indivisible or unitary. Divisible just means the task can be broken up into subparts. Unitary is a task in which the work can't be divided up among individuals. If you identify that your task is divisible, it might be better suited to a group contribution. Task combination refers to whether a task is additive or averaging, or also compensatory is another name used for it. An additive task is a task in which the inputs of each group member are just added together to create the group's performance. So an additive task is like my cogs example earlier. If you want to know how many cogs the group created, you just have to add each member's number together. A compensatory task or averaging task is a task in which the group input is combined such that the average of your performance is what your group contributed. Think about a group presentation you have to give in a speech class where you're all going to receive a grade based on the group's performance. Now, we could grade that different ways, but I know when I took a speech class, we all got a grade based on our performance. So that was the average of each of our contributions. We didn't get graded individually. The next category is whether a task is disjunctive or conjunctive. Disjunctive just refers to a task in which the group performance is determined by your worst contributing member, whereas conjunctive is by your best contributing member. Each of these has different challenges, and in general, groups that have this disjunctive contribution don't work as well as a group task. Anyway, assessment can refer to whether a task is a maximizing or intellective task. A maximizing task involves how much work a group can get done in a given period, where an intellective task is a decision or creative output of a group. Now, in a maximizing task, the way that your group allocates the work is just making sure that the most work done gets possible. But an intellective task is about the best product possible, not the most work. Creating a poem or an art project, for example, it's not about doing the most work, it's about doing the best work. Each requires a different set of skills in a group. Finally, task clarity can be divided based on criterion or judgmental. Criterion being a task in which there is a clearly correct answer, and judgmental in which there is no one correct answer. It is based on someone's judgment. In general, for each of these situations, you're going to experience what we call coordination loss, which is loss in productivity when a group of individuals is getting together just based on not being able to communicate with each other. This is a big contributor to the group size effect that we see. Larger groups work less efficiently together, no matter what kind of task they're completing. The larger your group gets, the more your process losses will accumulate. One of my favorite books to read about psychology is called Mistakes Were Made But Not by Me. And one of the examples that they open that book with is of the decision of people around Richard Nixon and his administration to engage in the illegal actions that would become the Watergate scandal, if you're familiar with the Watergate scandal. And it's a fascinating look into how a group of what it appears to be, they were intelligent individuals that made good decisions, but came to some conclusions that if they stepped out and got objective about it were ridiculous. So they thought they could get away with this and that it would help them. Anyway, I think this is a great example to start that book with of how groupthink can take over. And groupthink is when members of a group who otherwise could make good decisions on their own all converge on the same solution and go along with what the group has decided without giving that decision very strong scrutiny. So groupthink can be a process that is positive. So at a certain point, you want to go along with what the group is suggesting, because working together as a group on a solution that's not optimal is often a better strategy than delaying your action as a group until you find the perfect solution. Because there's, perfectionism is an issue, and there's often not a perfect solution. But groupthink can lead to following along with the group in some very bad decision making. Some problems that you see related to groupthink are like groups that are more likely to engage in this kind of mass conformity are more likely to stereotype others that are not part of their group. For example, in that Watergate scandal, it was many Republicans participating in that. They were more likely to believe that Democrats as a group were all the same, all had these negative things in common, instead of seeing them as individuals, just like they saw people in their own party. There's also this feeling of moral superiority when your group starts to all vibe with each other and agree with each other. You feel like your decisions are the correct decisions, not because they're the most logical, but because they have the weight of morality behind them. And finally, the biggest problem with groupthink that leads to all these other problems is ignoring that there might be legitimate alternative solutions to a problem. So, what are some things that make you more prone to groupthink? Well, we talked about group identity earlier. Group identity is a good thing. If I identify with a group that I'm a part of, then I'm feeling good about being a part of the group. I'm feeling good about contributing to the group. I want to agree with the group. But group displays have a social function. And if the social function eclipses the logical capacities that you have, this can lead to problems. So I wear, for example, I wear clothing that has the name of my university on it. I don't do this because I think my university is superior. I do this because I'm proud of being part of my university. Where things can become a problem is where those bleed into each other, where you think that just because you identify with your group automatically means that your group is superior and that you must stick with your group no matter what, right or wrong. And now, we often don't stick with our group because we think the group is wrong, but we want to support them anyway. Actually, what's happening is this group polarization effect where your attitude towards issues at the beginning of entering a group get more extreme over time as you're part of a group. So it's not that you disagree with the group and you believe in them anyway. It's that your attitudes get more extreme over time just being part of a group. We can divide this into the ABCs of social psychology and think about, your behavior is whether you do things for the group or not. On the affective level, you start to identify more and more with the group and get more polarized because it feels good when you agree with other people in your group. It feels good when you all work on solutions together to the same problem. From a cognitive standpoint, your brain is also engaging in biases and shortcuts and heuristics that lead you to being more likely to agree with a group. Things like confirmation bias, because when you have a strong group identity, you're more likely to see information that confirms how your group feels about an issue and ignore information that contradicts how your group feels about an issue, for example. So those ABCs, affect, behavior, and cognition, all start to work together to reinforce your group identity. All right, we got kind of negative there at the end of that section about ways that groups can lead to negative outcomes. Let's talk about ways that we can make sure that our groups lead to more positive outcomes. How can you do better when working in a group? Well, first of all, acknowledging the biases that can occur, being aware that groupthink can occur, is the first step into avoiding it. So there's this thing that's been called the illusion of group effectivity or efficaciousness. This is just our belief that the group we're a part of is getting more done than it actually is. But it's an illusion, probably created by the fact that we are aware of what work we're putting in and what the group is doing, and we see that the work the group has done is a lot more than what we could have got done ourselves. But often people overestimate how much their group is actually accomplishing, especially if you are tied up into the group identity with your own social identity. You don't recognize whether the group is actually getting a lot done or you're just proud of what you're doing as a group. I think it's interesting that psychologists have researched, can we actually train groups to come to better decisions? And the answer appears to be yes, especially if you're training people on things like effective communicating in a group, effective decision making in a group. And it's particularly effective if you're training the same group of people in your training that actually work together in a group later on. Now, the next question I have is that I know about social loafing, right? Social loafing is when you become part of a group, your work ethic tends to get a little bit worse because I know when I'm part of a group that maybe I don't have to contribute a lot. Nobody will notice that I'm not putting in a lot of work with the group, right? I'm aware that I engage in social loafing. So as a psychologist, I can ask, how do we get people not to engage in social loafing? Well, one of the simple methods is to make sure that each person's contribution to the group output is publicly visible. So if, for example, you're dividing tasks up, when you're assigning tasks to individuals in a group, make sure that each person has available to them exactly what each group member is going to contribute. So that if somebody does engage in social loafing, they don't put in the work, that is very publicly visible to the entire group. Another thing just has to do with self-interest, having incentives both at the group level and at the individual level for completing the task. If you are in a group project, for example, or you're assigned to a group or committee at your workplace, knowing that there's going to be a reward for good group performance makes people perform better. Nothing extraordinary there. So we all know about social loafing. Some psychologists have started to question exactly why do individuals engage in social loafing. Many of the early studies on social loafing just assumed it was a natural part of working in a group, that once you know you're working in a group, you will put in a little bit less effort. But some psychologists have started to wonder, is social loafing a learned behavior? For example, is it a habit that you develop that you could break with some effort? The answer is possibly yes. Are there some circumstances in which social loafing is less likely to occur? Are there some groups of people who use less social loafing? Well, one team found that they could predict your levels of social loafing based on your participation in team-based sports. Individuals that are used to working with a team because they were on a team-based sport engage in less social loafing later on. They've possibly learned how to avoid that behavior, or they just in their life experience situations in which they genuinely enjoyed contributing to a group, so they don't have that behavior of social loafing as much. Now, circling back around to things like groupthink and certain ideas dominating the conversation or dominating a group's decision making, poor communication is one of the biggest contributing factors to process loss, to groups that are not working very well or engaging in groupthink. So how can you avoid this bad communication? Well, the biggest piece of advice that I have here is allowing people in a group to express their opinions that don't agree with the group. So allowing someone in a group to be a devil's advocate for example, and express their opinions that don't go along with the majority. Breaking into subgroups, breaking your large group into smaller groups so that more people are able to express their opinion and get it out to other people and share ideas. But in general, just be open to dissenting opinions and actively reward people who speak up and give opinions that don't match with the majority. Another great solution to these communication issues, especially as the group size gets bigger, communication issues get worse, is to set specific goals for a group and sub-goals that you can complete along the way. By dividing a task into smaller tasks, you give individuals and subgroups specific goal marks that they're able to reach. That not only improves communication because people know specific tasks they can work on, but it improves morale because after you complete each task, you can feel good about that before going back to the group and continuing to work on a big problematic issue. A final point I want to make about group ideas is diversity. And you'll see if you search this in the literature, people use diversity to refer to diversity among group members of ideas, personalities, but could also refer to gender diversity, ethnic diversity, and so on. Now, a lot of the research shows that if you have a diverse group of people, no matter which of those definitions that you include, it can benefit things such as creativity. So a group that has people that come from different backgrounds, whatever those backgrounds are, tends to be more creative in some circumstances, but not others. Some research finds that more diverse groups, like ethnically diverse groups, actually it can cause problems. It appears that the key here is whether the group is one that encourages collaboration and encourages expression of ideas. If you're part of a group that wants to engage in conformity and groupthink, then diversity is not really a benefit. So cognitive diversity in particular is diversity of ideas, diversity of personalities and perspectives, can be useful at the brainstorming stage, but again, if there's, like we've discussed, if there's too many different perspectives, this can actually be harmful for a group because it's hard to pick the best solution if there are too many solutions presented to pick from. There's also, even though in general the research supports that having both men and women on a panel, having people from different ethnicities in a working group, that kind of diversity is typically good for groups. It can be harmful under some circumstances. If minority group members are very much in the minority, it can lead to this tokenization effect. If you have a panel made of mostly men with just a couple women on it, for example, the women can feel that their presence there was as a token representing women and not as another contributing member to the panel. So if somebody that's part of the minority group, either a minoritized group in society or somebody who their group doesn't make up a large percentage of the company as part of a group, then that stereotype threat that they're experiencing can actually lead to them not contributing very much to the group. In terms of diverse personalities, typically it tends to be better, but too many diverse personalities and perspectives can lead to clashing viewpoints, which can lead to a group not agreeing. So in general, diversity with any of these definitions is good unless there's too much of it, or unless the diverse perspectives are a minority and don't feel like their contributions are being valued. Right, as always, if you want to learn more about any of the issues from this presentation, here are the references I used for this presentation. My takeaway message, I think, is that psychologists have put a lot of effort into studying what makes groups work better or worse together. In general, process loss is the biggest danger. The biggest source of process loss is communication issues among groups. That is kind of my takeaway message. When you work with a group, you have to be very careful that everyone's voice can be heard, should be heard.